This lecture will serve as a quick how-to guide to diagramming arguments. Steps 1 and 2 are to find all of the premise and conclusion indicators in your argument. You can see there are a number of different conclusion and premise indicators. These lists are not inclusive. There are many more, but these are some of the most common ones, so you'll want to memorize them. Then you want to identify your premises and conclusions. So step 3, I start by identifying the conclusion, because there's only one conclusion in the argument. So as soon as you found it, you're done with that. And then I identify any sub-conclusions if there are any. Step 4, well, everything that is left once you've identified the conclusion and sub-conclusion should be your premises. It's possible there might be some extraneous statements that don't really serve any purpose in there, but for the most part, the arguments you'll be given will be fairly cleaned up, and what you'll be left with is just the premises. We call them the explicit premises because they are the premises that are explicitly stated by the author, as opposed to implicit premises or sub-conclusions or even conclusions, which are statements that are clearly implied by the argument but are not explicitly stated by the author. Now, step 5 you might need to skip and come back to later when you are actually diagramming the argument, because sometimes you don't know what implicit premises or sub-conclusions or so forth that you need until you get to that point. We're going to follow some conventions with labeling premises. So explicit premises will be labeled P1, P2, P3. Implicit premises will be labeled the same way, except we'll put an I in front of it to indicate that it's something you're adding to the argument. Sub-conclusions will be labeled as SC1, SC2, etc., with implied sub-conclusions being ISC1, ISC2, etc. And you will label your conclusion as C. You don't need a number there because there's only going to be one. If it's an implied conclusion, then you write IC. So these labels will be helpful, particularly when we get to analyzing arguments, and it will be able to refer to them easily. Okay, and then we want to, so now at this point we're at the level of sentences. What I do is I first break them down into different sentences, but some of the sentences we need to break apart still further, and some we need to leave just as they are. So there are some sentences you can and should break apart, and others which you should never break. So sentences that should be broken apart are sentences that contain both a premise and a sub-conclusion or conclusion. And you'll be able to tell because there'll be premise indicators in them or a conclusion indicator that kind of serves as a way to join them. So here you have a premise indicator joining a statement onto a conclusion. That's fairly common. But so is this second format, where you just have the premise indicator, but clearly this is the premise. But what's this? So it must be the conclusion. We're also going to break apart conjunctions. However, we will never break apart disjunctions, conditionals, biconditionals, or negations. If you break them apart, then they say something different than when they're together. So we don't want to change the meaning of the sentences. Then we need to make sure all of the statements are complete independent statements whose truth value can be judged on their own. So we need to remove or incorporate parenthetical statements just to clean it up. Remove any premise or conclusion indicators. Standardize concepts by, if there are different words used to mean the same thing in different premises, we need to make sure that they are all the same when we're done. And we need to replace pronouns with a reference wherever possible. And rewrite conditionals in standard form. Once you've done all that, you're ready to diagram the argument. I will give you some more tutorials where I actually walk through diagramming arguments, so you see how that works.